The bitter cold of December 1914 gripped the Western Front like a frozen fist of death. Private Thomas Bennett crouched in the muddy British trench, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he clutched his Lee Enfield rifle with numb fingers. At 28 years old, he had already seen more horror than most men witness in a lifetime. He carried his wife Sarah's last letter in his breast pocket next to his heart, the ink slightly smudged from the dampness that seemed to permeate everything in this godforsaken place. Just a few hundred yards away, across the deadly expanse of no man's land, German soldiers waited in their own trenches. Between them lay a wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, and the frozen bodies of men who had tried to cross that terrible space. The ground was so churned up by artillery that it resembled the surface of the moon more than the French countryside it had once been. Bennett had never imagined war could be like this when he enlisted 6 months earlier. The recruitment posters back in Manchester had promised glory, adventure, and a chance to serve king and country. They showed brave soldiers marching triumphantly, not men living like rats in holes, surrounded by the constant stench of death, decay, and human waste. The reality was mud that never dried, lice that never stopped biting, and the ever-present fear that the next shell might have your name on it. The young private clutched his rifle tighter, remembering his last conversation with Sarah before shipping out to France. They had been married for only 2 years, and she was just beginning to show signs of the pregnancy they had hoped for so desperately. "Come home to me, Tommy," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face as they stood on the platform at Victoria Station. "Promise me you'll come home to us." He had promised confidently, but now, surrounded by the horrors of trench warfare, that promise seemed harder to keep with each passing day. The trenches themselves were a marvel of misery. Carved into the earth like surgical wounds, they zigzagged across the landscape in an endless pattern designed to minimize damage from artillery strikes. The walls were reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks, but they still crumbled regularly under bombardment. Duckboards provided precarious footing over the perpetual mud, but they were slippery and often broken. Dugouts carved into the trench walls offered minimal shelter, barely enough room for a man to curl up and try to forget where he was. Christmas Eve arrived with a heavy snowfall that began just after sunset, blanketing the battlefield in pristine white. For the first time in months, the landscape looked clean, peaceful even. The snow muffled the usual sounds of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the crack of sniper rifles, the groans of wounded men calling for their mothers in half a dozen languages. Bennett sat in the trench, sharing a can of cold beef stew with his closest friend, Corporal James Mitchell from Liverpool. The two had become inseparable since training camp, watching each other's backs through the hell of their first battle at Ypres. Mitchell was a dock worker before the war, a man who understood hard labor and harder times. He had a wife and 3 children back home, and he carried their photograph everywhere, showing it to anyone who would look. "Quiet tonight, isn't it?" Mitchell observed, spooning the cold stew into his mouth without enthusiasm. "Haven't heard Jerry's guns for hours." Bennett nodded, pulling Sarah's letter from his pocket for the 100th time that day. The paper was worn soft from handling, and he knew every word by heart. She wrote about the baby growing inside her, about her job at the munitions factory, about how the whole neighborhood was praying for the boys overseas. She mentioned that Mrs. Henderson from next door had received a telegram about her son, and Bennett's stomach clenched knowing what that meant. What would you do if you found yourself in such a terrifying situation, so far from home on Christmas Eve? As darkness deepened, something extraordinary began to unfold along the German lines. Bennett first noticed it as a glimmer, then another, then dozens of flickering points of light appearing above the enemy trenches. At first, he thought it might be muzzle flashes, preparation for another night attack. His heart rate quickened, and he reached for his rifle. But something about these lights were different. They were steady, warm, and strangely comforting. "Candles!" whispered Sergeant Williams, squinting through the periscope with disbelief in his voice. Williams was a veteran of the South African campaign, a man who had seen everything warfare could offer, but this was something new. The bloody Germans are lighting candles. More lights appeared, and he could see they were attached to small trees. Christmas trees! The Germans had somehow procured dozens of small evergreens and were decorating them with candles, bits of colored paper, and what looked like small ornaments made from spent bullet casings. It was simultaneously beautiful and surreal. Christmas decorations rising from trenches that had been designed for killing. Then came the singing. It started as a single voice, young and clear, carrying across no man's land on the still winter air. The melody of O Tannenbaum drifted between the lines, sung in German but instantly recognizable. Soon other voices joined in, creating a chorus that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The German soldiers were celebrating Christmas, right there in the middle of a war zone. Bennett felt his throat tighten as he recognized the tune. It was the same melody as O Christmas Tree, a song Sarah used to sing while decorating their small apartment back in Manchester. She had a beautiful voice, clear and sweet, and she would hum Christmas carols all through December. The memory hit him like a physical blow, bringing tears to his eyes that had nothing to do with the cold wind.
Captain Morrison emerged from his dugout, a troubled expression on his weathered face. At 35, he was a career officer who had seen action in the Boer War and various colonial skirmishes, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His orders from headquarters were crystal clear: maintain position, prevent enemy advancement, and engage hostile forces on site. But how could he order his men to fire on soldiers who were singing Christmas carols? The singing continued, with different voices taking the lead on different verses. When the first song ended, another began, Stille Nacht, which Bennett recognized as Silent Night. The voices were young, many of them probably no older than himself, carrying melodies that spoke of home, family, and peace on earth. It was impossible to imagine these singers as the same enemy soldiers who had been trying to kill him just hours earlier. Have you ever experienced a moment when humanity triumphed over conflict, even in the smallest way? When the German songs concluded, an unexpected silence fell over the battlefield. The usual sounds of war, distant artillery, nervous movement in the trenches, the occasional rifle shot, all seemed to pause, as if the entire front was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere in the British trenches, a voice began to sing Silent Night in English. Bennett recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to William Thompson, a choir boy from Yorkshire who had joined up on his 18th birthday. Thompson had the voice of an angel, trained in church choirs since childhood, and when he sang, even the most hardened veteran would stop and listen. Now his voice carried across the battlefield like a prayer, clear and pure in the winter air. Soon dozens of British voices joined in, creating a response to the German chorus. The two sides took turns singing, each group listening respectfully to the other. When the British sang the first Noel, the Germans responded with Es ist ein Ross entsprungen. It was as if an invisible bridge had been built across no man's land, connecting two groups of homesick young men who wanted nothing more than to see their families again. The singing continued for over an hour, with both sides seeming to compete not for military advantage, but for the most beautiful rendition of beloved Christmas hymns. Bennett found himself humming along, remembering childhood Christmases in Manchester, midnight mass at St. Mary's, his mother's Christmas pudding, and the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she opened presents. As the musical exchange continued, something even more remarkable began to happen. Individual soldiers started calling out Christmas greetings across no man's land. "Merry Christmas, Fritz," shouted someone from the British lines. "Frolicke Weihnachten, Tommy," came the reply from the German side. Laughter began to mix with the singing, genuine laughter that seemed impossible in such a place. Corporal Mitchell nudged Bennett with his elbow. "Would you look at that?" he whispered, pointing toward the German lines. A soldier had climbed out of his trench and was standing in full view, holding what appeared to be a bottle. He raised it in a toasting gesture toward the British lines, then took a drink and called out something in German that sounded friendly. More German soldiers began to appear above their trenches, and Bennett could see that they were young men, much like himself. They weren't the savage barbarians described in British propaganda, but frightened boys far from home, trying to find some comfort on Christmas Eve. Some held up photographs, presumably of wives and children back home. Others waved makeshift white flags, handkerchiefs tied to rifle barrels. Can you imagine the courage it took for those first soldiers to stand up and make themselves targets? As Christmas morning dawned, painting the snow-covered battlefield in shades of pink and gold, something unprecedented happened. A German soldier appeared above his trench, holding his hands high above his head. Instead of a weapon, he carried a small Christmas tree decorated with candles and what looked like pieces of chocolate hanging from the branches. Bennett could see he was young, probably no older than 25, with blonde hair and a nervous but genuine smile. "Englander! Englander!" he called out in heavily accented English. "Christmas! No shoot! Christmas!" The German soldier began walking slowly across no man's land, stepping carefully around shell craters and coils of barbed wire. Other German soldiers appeared above their trenches, some carrying bottles, others with their hands raised in peaceful gestures. Some held up pictures of their families, and one elderly sergeant was actually carrying what looked like a small accordion. Bennett looked at Corporal Mitchell, then at Sergeant Williams, and finally at Captain Morrison. The captain's face showed the weight of an impossible decision. Military protocol demanded they fire immediately. These could be enemy soldiers attempting a ruse, a trick to get close enough for a surprise attack. Orders from high command were explicit about fraternizing with the enemy. Court-martial was the prescribed punishment for such violations. But Captain Morrison looked into the faces of his men and saw something that transcended military regulations. He saw young men who had been asked to endure hell on earth, who had followed orders without question for months, who deserved a moment of humanity even in the midst of inhumanity. More importantly, he looked across no man's land and saw not enemy soldiers, but fellow human beings extending an offer of peace. "Stand down, lads," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "It's Christmas." The effect of those words was electric. British soldiers began emerging from their trenches cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized no shots were being fired. Bennett found himself climbing over the parapet, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with excitement and anticipation. His boots crunched through the snow as he walked across ground that had been contested with thousands of lives, but was now as peaceful as a village common on Christmas morning. The German soldier who had initiated the encounter met Bennett halfway, in the center of no man's land where so many had died. Up close, Bennett could see that the young German was trembling, whether from cold, fear, or emotion. He couldn't tell. The man extended his hand with a shy smile.
"Merry Christmas," the German said in careful English, his pronunciation betraying hours of practice. "I am Klaus Weber, from Munich." Bennett shook the offered hand, surprised by its firmness and warmth. "Thomas Bennett," he replied, "from Manchester. Merry Christmas, Klaus." Klaus reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph, which he handed to Bennett with obvious pride. It showed a little girl with blonde pigtails, not more than 3 years old, sitting on a woman's lap in front of what looked like a bakery. The child was laughing, her mouth open in obvious delight. "Mein Daughter," Klaus said, his English faltering with emotion. "Greta. She is 3 years. I am baker, like mein father." He pointed to the building in the background of the photograph. "This is our bakery. I make bread, cakes, Christmas stollen for holiday." Bennett felt his own throat tighten as he looked at the photograph. The little girl could have been any child from any country, innocent, joyful, completely unaware that her father was fighting in a war hundreds of miles from home. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out the photograph of Sarah that he carried everywhere. "My wife," he said, showing Klaus the picture. "Sarah. We're expecting our first child." Klaus studied the photograph with genuine interest, then smiled broadly. "She is very beautiful. The baby, it will be beautiful too." He made a gesture with his hands to indicate Sarah's pregnancy, and Bennett nodded. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary day in the history of warfare.
Soldiers from both sides emerged from their trenches like flowers blooming after a long winter. The deadly ground of no man's land was transformed into an impromptu festival ground, with enemies becoming friends in a matter of minutes. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Could you have been brave enough to cross that deadly ground? German and British soldiers exchanged gifts with the enthusiasm of children. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, buttons cut from uniforms, small handmade trinkets. Anything that could serve as a token of goodwill was freely shared. Bennett traded his brass regimental button for a piece of Klaus's mother's Christmas stollen, which the young baker had been saving for Christmas Day. The bread was dense and sweet, filled with fruits and nuts, unlike anything Bennett had ever tasted. Some of the German soldiers had brought bottles of schnapps, which they shared generously with their former enemies. The British responded with their rations of rum and whatever tea they could brew over small fires that were quickly lit in shell craters. Soon, informal groups were gathered around these fires, with German and British soldiers sitting side by side, attempting to communicate through a mixture of broken English, schoolboy German, and universal gestures. Bennett spent much of the morning talking with Klaus about their lives before the war. Despite the language barrier, they managed to understand each other remarkably well. Klaus had learned his trade in his father's bakery, starting as a small boy by sweeping flour from the floor and gradually working his way up to making his own bread. He described the early morning hours he loved, when the ovens were warming and the shop filled with the smell of fresh baking. Bennett, in turn, told Klaus about his work as a carpenter in Manchester, how he had learned the trade from his uncle, and his dreams of building a house for Sarah and their coming child. He described a satisfaction of working with wood, of creating something useful and beautiful with his hands. Klaus nodded enthusiastically. He understood the pride of craftsmanship, the joy of creating something that brought pleasure to others. What came next was even more extraordinary. A German barber who had practiced his trade before the war set up shop next to a shell crater and began giving haircuts to British soldiers who hadn't seen a proper barber in months. An English medic treated a German soldier's infected wound, carefully cleaning and bandaging an injury that had been troubling the man for weeks. But perhaps the most remarkable sight was the football match that spontaneously organized itself in a relatively flat area between the lines. Someone had produced a makeshift ball, a bundle of rags wrapped tightly with string, and goalposts were marked with helmets and stacked rifles. Teams formed organically, with no regard for nationality. Germans and Englishmen played side by side, laughing and shouting encouragement in a mixture of languages that somehow everyone understood. Bennett found himself playing goalkeeper for a mixed team that included Klaus, 2 British corporals, and a German sergeant who proved surprisingly agile despite his age. The game had no formal rules and no official score, though everyone played with enthusiasm that bordered on hilarity. When someone scored a goal, players from both teams would cheer together, caught up in the simple joy of play. Can you imagine playing football with your enemy in the middle of a war zone? What would that feel like? The match ended in what everyone agreed was a draw, though nobody had been keeping careful score. What mattered was not who won, but the shared experience of play, the return to innocent competition after months of deadly serious conflict. For a few precious hours, the Western Front was transformed from a hellscape into something resembling a village green on a holiday afternoon. As the game concluded, photographs were taken, images that would later scandalize military commanders, but inspire generations with their message of human brotherhood. Soldiers posed together in mixed groups, German and British arms around each other's shoulders, smiling broadly at cameras that had been produced from various pockets and knapsacks. Throughout the day, Bennett and Klaus remained close companions, sharing stories and slowly developing a genuine friendship despite the circumstances that had made them enemies. Klaus spoke about his daughter Greta, how she loved to help in the bakery by sprinkling flour everywhere and helping to knead dough with her tiny hands. He described her laughter, the way she would run to greet him when he came home from work, the songs she was learning to sing.
Bennett, in turn, talked about his hopes for his unborn child.
his plans to teach the baby his carpentry skills, his dreams of having a workshop where he could create beautiful furniture. He described Sarah's excitement about becoming a mother, how she had already begun knitting tiny clothes and planning the nursery in their small apartment. The two men discovered they had more in common than they could have imagined. Both were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. Both valued family above all else. Both dreamed of returning to peaceful lives where their greatest concerns would be perfecting their trades and providing for their families. The war that had made them enemies seemed increasingly like a terrible misunderstanding between people who should have been friends. As afternoon wore on, other friendships were forming across the improvised neutral zone. Sergeant Williams found himself in deep conversation with a German corporal who had been a teacher before the war. Despite limited shared language, they managed to discuss literature, discovering a mutual admiration for Shakespeare that transcended national boundaries. Corporal Mitchell struck up a friendship with a German sailor who had somehow ended up in the trenches instead of on a ship. The two men compared notes about their families, showing each other worn photographs and attempting to communicate the universal experiences of fathers worried about providing for their children. But as evening approached, reality began to creep back in, like a cold fog rolling across the battlefield. Officers on both sides had been receiving urgent telegrams throughout the day from their respective high commands. The unauthorized ceasefire was creating panic in headquarters. Artillery barrages were already being planned for the next morning, and strict orders were being issued to prevent any repeat of this disgraceful breakdown in military discipline. Let us know in the comments what you think about what happened next. Captain Morrison gathered his men as the light began to fade, his face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "I've received direct orders from headquarters," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ceasefire is to end immediately. We must return to our positions before dark." The announcement hit the gathered soldiers like a physical blow. Men who had spent the day discovering their shared humanity were now being told to prepare to kill each other again. The contrast was almost unbearable. To go from friendship back to warfare in the space of a few hours seemed not just difficult, but morally impossible. The parting that followed was one of the most heartbreaking scenes in military history. Men who had been enemies at dawn were now saying goodbye like old friends who might never meet again. Addresses were exchanged with promises to write after the war. Final gifts were pressed into hands: a photo, a letter from home, a small keepsake that might help the receiver remember this extraordinary day. Klaus pressed a small wooden cross into Bennett's palm, a Christmas ornament that had been carved by his own father decades earlier. The wood was smooth from handling, and tiny figures had been etched into its surface with infinite care and patience. "For your wife," Klaus said, his English faltering with emotion as he struggled to find the right words. Tell her we are not so different. Tell her we all want to go home to our families. Tell her that enemies can be friends, if only for one day." Bennett felt tears freeze on his cheeks as he gripped the small wooden cross. The simple gift seemed to carry the weight of everything that had happened, everything that might have been possible if the world were different. "I'll tell her, Klaus, and I'll tell our child about you, about today. I'll pray that you make it back to Greta safely." The two men embraced briefly, awkwardly, unsure of the protocol for saying goodbye to a friend who had been an enemy just hours before. Around them, similar scenes were playing out as dozens of men struggled to return to their respective sides of a conflict that now seemed even more senseless than before. As both sides retreated to their trenches, the weight of what was about to resume pressed down on everyone like a physical burden. These men would soon be ordered to kill the very people they had just shared Christmas dinner with, played football with, laughed with. The psychological strain was almost unbearable. Could you return to fighting someone you had just shared Christmas with? What would you do in their situation? When the artillery began again on December 26, something had fundamentally changed on the Western Front. Bennett noticed that many shots from both sides deliberately fell wide of their targets. Marksmen who had been deadly accurate before Christmas seemed to have developed sudden problems with their aim. Both sides seemed reluctant to break the spell completely, to fully return to the business of killing after experiencing the alternative. Some soldiers later reported aiming deliberately high or low, unable to bring themselves to harm men they now knew as individuals rather than faceless enemies. Others wrote in letters home about the difficulty of returning to warfare after experiencing such profound human connection. The Christmas truce had demonstrated something that military commanders had always feared, that soldiers who see their enemies as human beings are far less effective at killing them. The official reports of December 25, 1914, made no mention of the Christmas truce. Military commanders were horrified by what they saw as a complete breakdown in discipline and quickly implemented strict orders to prevent such unauthorized fraternization in the future. Court-martials were threatened for any soldier caught communicating with the enemy. But the letters home told a different story entirely. Despite heavy censorship, word of the Christmas truce spread throughout Britain and Germany. Soldiers wrote to wives, mothers, and sweethearts about the miracle they had witnessed on the Western Front. They described enemies who became brothers, if only for a few precious hours. They wrote about shared humanity transcending political differences, about the power of Christmas to bring peace even to the most unlikely places. Bennett's letter to Sarah was typical of hundreds written in the days following Christmas 1914. He told her about Klaus, about the photograph of little Greta, about the football match and the singing and the wooden cross that he would treasure forever. He wrote about seeing the enemy as human beings rather than monsters, about understanding that the German soldiers were fighting for the same reasons as the British, because they had been told it was their duty, because they believed they were protecting their families and their way of life. Sarah's response, when it finally reached Bennett weeks later, was filled with wonder and hope. She wrote that the story had given her comfort during the long winter nights, that knowing such kindness was possible, even in wartime, had helped her believe that he would return safely. She promised to treasure Klaus's wooden cross and to tell their child about the Christmas when enemies became friends. Bennett did survive the war, though it cost him dearly. He returned to Manchester in 1918 with a wounded leg and memories that would haunt him for decades. But he also returned with Klaus's wooden cross, which he and Sarah placed on their mantle where it remained for the rest of their lives. Every Christmas Eve, Bennett would light a candle beside the cross and remember the day when peace conquered war, even if just for a moment. He often wondered about Klaus in the years that followed. Had the young baker made it home to Munich? Was he back in his family's bakery, making bread and Christmas stollen? Had little Greta grown up with stories about the Christmas when her father played football with English soldiers? Bennett liked to imagine Klaus teaching his daughter about the day when enemies chose friendship over fighting, when Christmas reminded the world that all people, regardless of nationality, share the same hopes and dreams to return home to those they care about most. The wooden cross that connected Thomas Bennett and Klaus Weber across the divide of war continues to inspire visitors to the Imperial War Museum. It stands as a small but powerful symbol of the day when Christmas reminded the world that peace on earth is not just a beautiful wish, but an achievable reality, if only we have the courage to reach across the divides that separate us and recognize our shared humanity. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. The Christmas Truce of 1914 remains one of the most remarkable events in military history, a testament to the power of human compassion to transcend even the most bitter conflicts. It reminds us that wars are fought not by nations, but by individual human beings who share far more in common than the ideologies that divide them. In a world that often seems consumed by hatred and division, the story of Thomas Bennett and Klaus Weber offers profound hope. The truce demonstrated that peace is not just a political concept, but a fundamental human desire that can emerge even in the most unlikely circumstances. When given the choice between killing and celebrating, between hatred and friendship, between war and peace, ordinary soldiers chose humanity. They chose to see their enemies as fellow human beings deserving of compassion and respect. Today, in our own time of global tensions and conflicts, the Christmas truce serves as a powerful reminder that understanding and friendship are possible even between the most bitter adversaries. It shows us that beneath uniforms and flags, beyond political rhetoric and national boundaries, we are all part of the same human family, sharing the same fundamental hopes for safety, love, and the chance to return home to those we care about most. The wooden cross that connected Thomas Bennett and Klaus Weber across the divide of war continues to inspire visitors to the Imperial War Museum. It stands as a small but powerful symbol of the day when Christmas reminded the world that peace on earth is not just a beautiful wish, but an achievable reality, if only we have the courage to reach across the divides that separate us and recognize our shared humanity.